When I was 17, I got into a car accident. It should have been the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me, but it wasn't. It was a snowy night, and the roads were slick with ice. I wasn't speeding, but it didn't matter. One moment I was driving down a back road near my house. The next I felt the tires slip, and the car losing traction. My hands jerked the wheel, but it was useless. The world spun, headlights illuminated the snow-covered trees for a brief second before I slammed into it. I don't remember the crash itself, just the sensation of weightlessness before everything went black. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital bed. The lights were too bright, my body ached like it had been run over, and my head throbbed so hard I thought it might split open. My parents were there, pale and shaken, but relieved to see me awake. The doctor explained my injuries, broken arm, cracked ribs, and a severe concussion. They wanted to keep me under observation for a few days to make sure I didn't have any internal bleeding. I could barely keep my eyes open as he talked, exhaustion tugging at me. The worst part was that I wasn't allowed to use my phone or watch TV. The doctor said too much stimulation could make my concussion worse. I could barely move because of the IV pumping painkillers and fluids into my arm, and I wasn't allowed to get up on my own. I hated hospitals. The sterile smell, the beeping machines, the two white walls, the only escape I had was sleep. So I let myself drift off. And that first night, I woke up to silence. The dim light close to the doorway was still on, casting long shadows across the room. I didn't know what had woken me up at first, but as I lay there, I heard it. Soft, muffled noises coming from the hallway outside my door. The shuffle of footsteps, the quiet murmur of voices. It wasn't strange. Hospitals never truly slept. Nurses and doctors moved around at all hours. I turned over, adjusting my position, my back now facing the door. My ribs ached with the movement, but I ignored it, trying to get comfortable again. Then I heard something else, a different sound. This time it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from inside my room. It was faint, barely audible. Like something gliding across the floor, not footsteps, not the rustling of fabric, something else. I held my breath, listening. Silence. Maybe I had imagined it. The painkillers, the concussion. It was easy to mistake things in the haze of half sleep. I exhaled, closed my eyes, and tried to convince myself that there was nothing there. Then the light flickered. For a brief second, the room dimmed before the bulb gave out completely. Darkness swallowed me. My heart pounded as I reached blindly for the call button. My fingers fumbled against the sheets, searching for it. Something moved, quick and close. The sound came from the foot of my bed. I wasn't alone. I forced myself to turn over, to look. The room was too dark to see anything beyond vague shapes, but I felt it. A presence. A weight in the air. Then, two red eyes, glowing, unblinking, stared directly at me. From the end of my bed. I screamed. The light snapped back on, and within seconds, two nurses rushed into the room. They asked me what was wrong, but I couldn't speak. My throat was dry, my body frozen. I stared at the empty space where the eyes had been. Had I imagined it? A nightmare? That's what I told them. What I told myself. A bad dream. A trick of the concussion. The nurses checked my vitals, replaced the IV bag, and told me to get some rest. I nodded, but I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, my parents came to visit, bringing breakfast. I didn't tell them what happened. It sounded ridiculous, even in my own head. The doctor checked on me later that afternoon. He was happy with my progress, but wanted to keep me one more night, just to be safe. I pleaded with him to let me go home, but he wouldn't budge. I didn't realize how much I wanted to leave until that moment. How deeply, in the pit of my stomach, I dreaded spending another night in that room. I convinced myself I was just overreacting. The night came. My parents left, promising to pick me up first thing in the morning. I asked if one of them could stay, but they reassured me that I would be just fine. As soon as they were gone, the fear set in. I tried to stay awake, no matter how stupid it seemed. I didn't want to see those eyes again. But exhaustion is relentless. And my body gave in. I don't know how long I was asleep before I woke up again. At first, everything was normal. The dim light was still on. The room was empty. I exhaled, sitting up slightly, trying to shake the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. Then I heard a click. The room went dark. Panic set in immediately. I held my breath, listening, but the silence was thick and suffocating. Another click. The light came back on. I scanned the room. Nothing was there. Then click. Darkness. I heard it again. That noise. That thing moving across the floor. Then another click. Once again, the light came back on. Everything was normal. I exhaled and reached for the call button. As my fingers brushed over it, I saw them. Claws. Long, black, curling over the foot of my bed. I froze. My mind screamed at me to move, but I couldn't. Then, I heard the worst sound I could have imagined in that moment. Click. Darkness once again filled the room. The presence loomed closer. I could feel it. The air was thick, charged with something unnatural. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. It's like I was frozen. Then, another click. The light came back on. I scanned the room. Nothing. No claws. Nothing. I exhaled a sigh of relief. I was just seeing things. Maybe this concussion was worse than I thought. But then I heard something. Something directly from above me. I slowly looked up, and what I saw still gives me nightmares to this day. It had the shape of a man, but it wasn't. Its limbs were too long, its body stretched and unnatural. Its skin was completely black, absorbing the dim light like a void. Its face, if you could call it that, was grinning, a grotesque wide mouth filled with jagged teeth, and its eyes, red, glowing, watching me. Then I heard the dreadful click again as I was plunged into darkness. I screamed, I thrashed, kicking at my sheets, waiting for it to pounce. The lights flashed back on, and nurses burst into the room. I was still screaming. It took them over an hour to calm me down, and one of them even stayed with me for the rest of the night, sitting in a chair beside my bed. The next morning, the doctor discharged me. He thought I had been hallucinating because of my concussion, but I know I wasn't. Even now, all of these years later, I remember that thing was real, and sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear the click, and I wonder if it's still watching me. I've worked as a nurse in a small town hospital for 8 years. I've seen a lot: grief, joy, strange medical cases, but nothing haunts me like what happened that night. I still catch myself thinking about it, trying to convince myself it was just a dream, a fabrication of an overtired mind. But deep down, I know it wasn't. It was real. It was a slow night, the kind where the quiet feels unnatural, like the calm before a storm. Just before midnight, we got word that an ambulance was bringing in an unconscious young man. No injuries, no medical history, just collapsed and never woke up. There weren't many of us on shift. A coworker and I met the paramedics at the entrance as they wheeled him in. The man looked peaceful, like he was simply sleeping. His breathing was normal, his pulse steady. We got him into a room and I started routine checks while my coworker went to fetch the doctor. There was nothing out of the ordinary at first, no visible trauma, no fever, nothing. But as I lifted his arm to check for any hidden injuries, I saw it. A black mark just beneath his arm. At first I thought it was a weird bruise, but when I pulled up his sleeve, my stomach twisted. His veins were black. Thick dark lines ran from under his skin, crawling from his shoulder down towards his chest. It didn't look like bruising. It looked unnatural, like something was spreading beneath the surface. I grabbed a pair of scissors and carefully cut his shirt away, and that's when I saw it. A circular black mass just below the front of his shoulder blade, pulsating faintly. From it, those inky veins snaked outwards like tendrils, sinking into his body. It wasn't a rash, it wasn't an infection, it was something else. Then the doctor entered the room. He stopped mid-step, his eyes locking onto the thing on the man's chest. For a second, he didn't move. Then forcing himself forward, he walked across to the other side of the table. He stared at the black mass. He didn't have to say anything for me to know that he had no idea what he was looking at. He grabbed a pair of forceps and pointed at the mass. He told me to look closely. I leaned in, and that's when I saw it shift. It wasn't just pulsating, it was moving. I jerked back, my heart hammering. The doctor pressed the forceps against it gently, testing the surface. The moment the metal made contact, the mass twitched, actually twitched as if something beneath the skin had reacted. Then it moved again. A slow, deliberate writhing. Something inside of him was alive. I don't know what disturbed me more, the movement itself or the look on the doctor's eyes. He was scared, genuinely scared. He shook his head. He said it was beyond him. He quickly ordered me to hook up the patient to the monitoring equipment and quarantine the room. Then he left, saying he knew someone he could call. I did as I was told, but every moment I spent in that room felt unbearable. The thing inside the man never stopped shifting. Sometimes it would go on for a few minutes before another ripple moved under his skin, as if it were adjusting, waiting. An hour later, they arrived. A group of men in suits, silent and efficient. One of them wore all black, his presence commanding, his face unreadable. The others were in full-body medical suits, sterile and personal. They barely acknowledged us as they entered the room, moving the patient onto a strange mobile bed. He was gone within minutes, no paperwork, no explanations. They wheeled him out in an unmarked vehicle, something that resembled an ambulance but wasn't. No sirens, no hospital logos, just blacked out windows and a hum so quiet it barely registered. They all left, all except the man in the black suit. The man had a long, closed-door conversation with the doctor. When he finally left, the doctor called me into his office. I sat down, waiting for some kind of explanation. He told me it was an infectious parasite, dangerous. They had to move him for safety reasons. That was all he said, but his expression gave away more. He didn't believe it, and he didn't want me asking questions. When I pressed further, where did they take him? What kind of parasite? He cut me off. He told me to let it go. His voice was firm, unlike anything I'd ever heard from him. I tried again, but this time, he stood. He told me if I ever brought this up to anyone again, I would be fired. While there was definitely anger in his voice, I noticed something else. Fear. And that was the end of it. No reports, no records, no mentions of any patients in any hospital files. It was as if it never existed. But I know what I saw. And I know that man in the black suit wasn't from any medical agency. To this day, I wonder what happened to that patient. I wonder what was inside of him. And worst of all, I wonder if it was something they truly contained. When I started my new job as a night shift nurse at the hospital, I knew it wouldn't be easy. The long, quiet hours, the eerie stillness of the building at night. It wasn't exactly what I had imagined when I first entered nursing school. But I needed the experience, and working nights was just part of the deal. The first week went smoothly, and since I was still new, I spent most of my time training under Erin, a seasoned nurse who had been working the night shift for years. She was patient, friendly, and knew the ins and outs of the hospital better than anyone. Our wing was one of the older parts of the hospital. The walls had a faded yellowish tint, and the floors creaked in certain places, betraying the building's age. The overhead lights flickered now and then, and sometimes, when the halls were empty, I swore I could hear whispers echoing from somewhere unseen. But I chalked it up to exhaustion and nerves. One thing that did stand out to me, though, was room 324. Unlike the others, its door remained closed at all times. The bed was always neatly made, but never occupied. I asked Erin about it once. She just shrugged and told me they didn't use that room. No real reason. That's just the way things were. I didn't question it. Not then, at least. By the time my second week rolled around, I was feeling more confident. I was beginning to settle into the rhythm of the night shift, checking vitals, administering medications, restocking supplies, assisting patients when they needed help in the middle of the night. The quiet hours gave me time to go over the charts, monitor fluids, and make notes for the day staff. That night, I clocked in as usual and checked the computer to see which patients were in our wing. As I was skimming through the list, something caught my eye. Room 324 was occupied. My stomach twisted slightly. I knew for a fact that room hadn't been used since I started working here. But there it was, Henry Foster, 72 years old. According to his file, he lived alone and had fallen at home, sustaining minor injuries. The doctor wanted to keep him under observations for a couple days. I shook off my unease and started my rounds. Patients needed their medications, charts had to be updated, and vitals had to be checked. An hour passed, and it was time to check on Henry. I approached room 324, hesitating slightly before opening the door. The dim glow from the bedside lamp was the only source of light, casting long shadows against the wall. Henry was awake. He sat up in bed, hands resting on a blanket, staring straight ahead at the far wall. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even acknowledge my presence when I walked in. I introduced myself and told him I'd be taking care of him that night. Nothing, no reaction. I moved closer, pulling up a chair beside his bed, and gently asked if he needed anything. Finally, his gaze shifted to me. His eyes were pale and cloudy, the kind you see in patients who have lived long enough to carry the weight of too many years. After a long pause, he said he would like some water. I got up, filled a cup from the sink, and handed it to him. He took a sip, set it down, and then he asked me where Nora was. I scanned his chart again in my mind. There had been no mention of a Nora. I asked him who she was, and he told me she was his wife. I told him I wasn't sure where she was, but I'd be happy to call her in the morning to let her know that he was asking about her. He nodded, but went right back to staring at the wall. The whole interaction left me unsettled, but I chalked it up to fatigue. Some older patients experienced confusion, especially at night. I stepped out of the room, returning to my duties, administering medications, adjusting IVs, checking vitals. I ran into Aaron briefly, but we were too busy to talk much. The night dragged on, and before I knew it, it was time to check on Henry again. I approached room 324 once more, pushing open the door quietly, expecting to find Henry asleep. He wasn't in bed. He stood by the window, staring out into the night. The light from the lamp barely reached him, casting his figure in a strange, elongated shadow across the floor. I stepped closer and asked if he was okay. He didn't turn at first. Then, slowly, he shifted his head towards me, his expression blank. He then said he was waiting for Nora. Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I swallowed my unease and told him I promised to call Nora in the morning, but for now he needed to rest. He didn't move. I reached out, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, trying to guide him back to bed. But when I did, he didn't budge. His body was rigid, almost unnaturally stiff. I gave another gentle nudge, and that's when his demeanor changed. His head snapped towards me, his eyes suddenly sharp and filled with something that hadn't been there before. His voice, once quiet and soft, rose into an angry growl as he demanded to know where Nora was. A cold dread settled over me. I tried to de-escalate, telling him that she was on her way, but I barely got the words out before he was in front of me, in a blink. It was almost impossibly fast. Suddenly, I realized that I couldn't breathe. Not like out of fear, like actually unable to breathe. A crushing pressure wrapped around my throat, though nothing was touching me. Panic surged through me as I struggled to inhale, my vision darkening around the edges. Henry's face twisted into something unrecognizable, something not human. The last thing I heard before everything went black was his voice, over and over, demanding to know what I had done to Nora. The next thing I knew, Erin was shaking me, her face pale with concern. A rush of adrenaline hit me and I shot up, gasping for air. Henry was gone. The room was empty. Erin pulled me out into the hallway, away from room 324. I tried to explain what had happened, but before I could, Erin cut me off with a question that made my blood run cold. She asked me if I saw Henry. I nodded, my heart still hammering in my chest. I asked her where he was. Erin took a deep breath before saying something I will never forget. She told me Henry isn't real. I stared at her in disbelief. She told me that room 324 had been abandoned for a reason. Over the years, multiple staff members had reported seeing an old man named Henry inside the room, always asking for his wife Nora. The stories varied, but they all shared the same eerie thread. Henry wasn't a patient. Henry had never been a patient. I ran to the files. There was no record of Henry Foster. I logged into the computer. Room 324 had never been occupied. It was impossible. I had seen him, spoken to him, felt him. For the next 6 months, I stayed at the hospital, but I never set foot in room 324 again, and I never saw Henry either. But even now, I wonder, was he just a lost soul lingering in a place that he had once been? Or was there something much darker waiting inside room 324?